The dinner rush at Murphy's Diner had been particularly hectic that October evening in 1989. The small roadside restaurant, nestled between cornfields along Route 34 in rural Nebraska, had seen a steady stream of truckers, traveling families and locals seeking comfort food before the weekend. Maggie Chen, the head cook and heart of Murphy's Kitchen, had worked her usual magic, sending out plate after plate of her famous meatloaf, buttery mashed potatoes, and green bean casserole that kept customers coming back for more. At 52, Maggie possessed an intuitive understanding of food that went beyond recipes. She could tell by the sizzle of onions in the pan when they were perfectly caramelized, knew exactly how long to let the gravy simmer to achieve that golden brown perfection. Her colleagues often joked that she could cook blindfolded, and in many ways, after 30 years in professional kitchens, she nearly could. The burgundy apron she wore, embroidered with tiny yellow flowers by her late mother, had become as much a part of her identity as her gentle smile and the way she hummed old folk songs while stirring pots. Before we continue with Maggie's story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us connect with viewers around the world who appreciate these real-life mysteries. Your support means everything to us. That Friday night, October 13th, 1989, started like any other. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and harvest, and the fluorescent lights of Murphy's cast their familiar warm glow across the checkerboard linoleum floor. Maggie arrived at 4 p.m., as she had every weekday for the past 7 years, hanging her worn leather purse on the hook beside the walk-in cooler and tying her mother's apron around her waist. She moved through her pre-dinner preparations with practiced efficiency, checking inventory, prepping vegetables, and starting the evening's soups. Linda Morrison, the evening waitress, remembered Maggie being in particularly good spirits that night. She was humming that song again, you know, Scarborough Fair, and she'd made extra cornbread because she said she had a feeling we'd need it, Linda would later tell investigators. Maggie had these instincts about things. She always knew when we'd be busy or when someone needed a kind word along with their coffee. The dinner service proceeded normally until around 8:30 p.m. The last order had been sent out, a chicken fried steak for Harold Brennan, a regular who drove the late-night delivery route for the grain elevator. Maggie had begun her nightly cleaning routine, the familiar dance of scrubbing pans, wiping down surfaces, and preparing the kitchen for the next day. Tom Murphy, the diner's owner, was in his office reconciling the day's receipts when he heard the back door of the kitchen slam shut. "I figured Maggie was taking out the trash," he would later tell the Douglas County Sheriff's deputies. "She always did that around 9 o'clock, right before we closed, but when I came out to lock up at 9:45, her apron was hanging on the prep station counter, folded neat as you please, like she always left it. But Maggie was gone. The parking lot held no clues. Maggie's 1984 Honda Civic sat exactly where she'd parked it that afternoon, keys still in her purse hanging by the cooler. Her coat remained draped over her usual chair in the break room. It was as if she had simply vanished into the crisp October night, leaving behind only questions and the lingering aroma of the evening's cooking. Tom called Maggie's apartment first, thinking perhaps she'd felt sick and walked home, though the 2-mile distance through rural farmland made that unlikely. When no one answered, he drove to her place on Maple Street, a small but tidy rental house she'd called home since moving to Waverly after her divorce. The windows were dark, her car wasn't in the driveway because it was still at the diner, and neighbors hadn't seen her. By midnight, Tom had contacted the sheriff's office. Deputy Sarah Fletcher, one of only 3 female officers in the county at the time, took the initial report. She'd eaten at Murphy's countless times and knew Maggie as a reliable, steady woman who'd never given anyone cause for concern. Maggie Chen was the kind of person who called if she was going to be 5 minutes late, Fletcher noted in her report. This disappearance was completely out of character. The initial investigation revealed few leads. Maggie had no known enemies, no financial troubles, and no romantic entanglements that might have led to conflict. Her ex-husband, Robert Chen, had moved to California 3 years earlier and had an ironclad alibi. He was attending his nephew's wedding in San Francisco that weekend, surrounded by dozens of witnesses. Maggie's only living relative, her sister Elizabeth in Denver, hadn't heard from her in several weeks, which wasn't unusual given their infrequent communication. As dawn broke over the Nebraska plains on October 14th, the disappearance of Maggie Chen became the town's most pressing mystery. Search parties organized by volunteers scoured the surrounding farmland, checking abandoned buildings, irrigation ditches, and grain silos. The State Patrol issued missing person bulletins across the Midwest. Local newspapers ran her photograph alongside headlines that would become painfully familiar. Local cook vanishes without trace. The investigation into Maggie's disappearance consumed the small town of Waverly for months. Sheriff Martin Kowalski, a 20-year veteran of rural law enforcement, had handled his share of missing persons cases, but most involved teenagers running away to the city or elderly folks with dementia wandering from their homes. Maggie's case was different. It was the kind of mystery that haunted everyone involved because it defied logical explanation. Detective Ray Hutchinson from the Nebraska State Patrol was assigned to assist the local investigation. A methodical man in his mid-40s, Hutchinson approached the case with systematic precision. He interviewed every customer who'd been in Murphy's diner that evening, tracked down the truckers whose logbooks showed they'd stopped for dinner, and even spoke with drivers who'd passed through Waverly around the time Maggie disappeared. The customer interviews painted a consistent picture of that final evening. Maggie had seemed her normal self, friendly, efficient, taking special care with each order. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, an elderly widow who ate at Murphy's every Friday, remembered Maggie asking about her arthritis and suggesting she try the evening's fish special because it was good for joints. Harold Brennan, the grain elevator driver who'd received the last order Maggie cooked, recalled her waving goodbye to him through the kitchen's service window as he left around 8:45 p.m. She called out, "Drive safe, Harold," just like she always did, he told Detective Hutchinson. Maggie treated all us regulars like family. That's what made this whole thing so hard to understand. The physical evidence at Murphy's diner yielded little. Crime scene technicians found Maggie's fingerprints throughout the kitchen as expected, but no signs of struggle. The back door showed no evidence of forced entry, and the alley behind the restaurant was paved, providing no useful footprints. Most puzzling was the condition of Maggie's apron. It had been carefully folded and placed on the prep station, suggesting she'd removed it intentionally before leaving. That apron was like a part of her, Linda Morrison explained to investigators. I never saw Maggie in the kitchen without it. The fact that she took it off and folded it so neatly. It was like she was saying goodbye to the place. As weeks turned to months, the investigation expanded beyond Waverly. Detective Hutchinson coordinated with law enforcement agencies across Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas, checking hospitals, morgues, and Jane Doe cases. The FBI became involved when the possibility of interstate transportation was considered, though no evidence supported abduction theories. Maggie's personal life was scrutinized with uncomfortable thoroughness. Investigators learned she'd moved to Waverly in 1982 following a difficult divorce from Robert Chen, whom she'd met while working at a restaurant in Omaha. The marriage had lasted 8 years, but produced no children, something neighbors knew had been a source of sadness for Maggie. She'd thrown herself into her work after the divorce, finding solace in the rhythm of professional cooking and the community of Murphy's diner. Maggie once told me that cooking for people was her way of taking care of the family she never had, remembered Father Michael Kowalski, pastor of St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Maggie attended Sunday Mass. She put love into every dish she prepared. That's not just a figure of speech, you could taste it in her food. The pastor's insight led investigators to examine Maggie's potential plans for the future. Had she been contemplating leaving Waverley? Her bank account showed no unusual withdrawals, and her landlord confirmed she'd paid October's rent on time. A search of her apartment revealed no packed bags, no letters of resignation, no indication she'd been planning a departure. However, one discovery did raise questions. Among Maggie's personal papers, investigators found a series of letters from a pen pal named Catherine Williams in Portland, Oregon. The correspondence, which had begun 6 months before Maggie's disappearance, revealed a deepening friendship between the two women. Catherine was also a divorcee who worked in food service, and their letters discussed everything from recipes to their shared experiences of starting over in middle age. Detective Hutchinson contacted Catherine Williams immediately. A soft-spoken woman in her late 40s, Catherine was devastated to learn of Maggie's disappearance. She confirmed their correspondence and provided copies of all Maggie's letters. Reading through them, investigators found no hint of distress or plans to disappear. Margaret wrote about feeling settled in Waverley, Catherine told Hutchinson during a lengthy phone interview. She loved her job at Murphy's and had started taking evening classes at the community college. Something about business management. She wanted to maybe open her own restaurant someday. These weren't the letters of someone planning to vanish. The community college angle proved significant. Maggie had indeed enrolled in a business fundamentals course that began in September 1989. Her instructor, Professor Janet Mills, described Maggie as one of her most engaged students. She attended every class, asked thoughtful questions, and often stayed after to discuss her ideas for a small restaurant specializing in comfort food, Professor Mills recalled. She'd missed only one class, the Thursday night before she disappeared, and she'd called to explain she was covering an extra shift at the diner. This revelation shifted the investigation's timeline. Maggie's Thursday night class would have ended at 9 p.m., meaning she would have driven directly from campus to Murphy's for her usual Friday shift. Investigators traced her route, interviewing gas station attendants and late-night business owners along the way, but found no witnesses who remembered seeing her Honda Civic that evening. As 1989 turned to 1990, the active investigation began to wind down. The case remained open, but without new leads or evidence, Detective Hutchinson was reassigned to other matters. Sheriff Kowalski continued to receive occasional tips from people claiming to have seen Maggie in various locations across the country, but each lead proved false upon investigation. The years following Maggie Chen's disappearance transformed her from a missing person into a local legend. In Waverley, Nebraska, her story became woven into the fabric of the community's collective memory, passed down through conversations at church socials, high school reunions, and the inevitable discussions that arose whenever someone new moved to town and asked about unsolved mysteries. Murphy's Diner struggled to find a replacement cook who could match Maggie's skill and dedication. Tom Murphy hired a succession of kitchen staff, but none could replicate the warmth and consistency that had made the restaurant a beloved local institution. Within 3 years of Maggie's disappearance, Murphy sold the diner to a chain restaurant company that demolished the building and erected a generic fast food establishment. The loss felt like a second disappearance to longtime residents who'd considered Murphy's a community gathering place. Linda Morrison, the waitress who'd worked alongside Maggie that final evening, left the food service industry entirely. She found work at the local bank and eventually became a loan officer, but she never forgot the mystery of her missing colleague. Every year, on October 13th, Linda would drive past the site where Murphy's Diner once stood, saying a quiet prayer for Maggie and wondering what had really happened that night. Detective Ray Hutchinson, now promoted to lieutenant, kept Maggie's case file on his desk throughout his career. He'd periodically review the evidence, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previously overlooked. As forensic technology advanced through the 1990s and 2000s, he submitted various pieces of evidence for updated analysis, but DNA testing and improved fingerprint databases yielded no new information. The Maggie Chen case taught me that sometimes people can just vanish, Hutchinson reflected in a 2010 interview with the Lincoln Journal-Star. Not because of elaborate conspiracies or criminal masterminds, but because something happens in that moment, something we may never understand, that changes everything. It's humbling for someone in law enforcement to accept that some puzzles don't have solutions. The case took on new relevance in the early 2000s when the FBI launched its National Missing Persons database, digitizing thousands of cold cases from across the country. Maggie's information was entered into the system, and her photograph was age-progressed to show how she might appear in her 60s. These updated images were distributed to law enforcement agencies and posted on early Internet missing persons websites, reaching a broader audience than ever before. In 2005, the case received renewed attention when a true crime television show featured Maggie's disappearance in an episode about mysterious vanishings in small-town America. The program brought dozens of new tips to the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, now under the leadership of Sheriff Amanda Torres. Most leads proved unfounded, but the publicity kept Maggie's story alive for a new generation of potential witnesses. One promising lead came from a truck driver named Dale Morrison, no relation to waitress Linda Morrison, who claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker matching Maggie's description on Interstate 80 near Grand Island on the night she disappeared. The woman, who'd given her name as Mary, had asked for a ride to Denver and seemed nervous throughout the journey. Morrison said he'd dropped her off at a truck stop east of the city around 4 a.m. on October 14, 1989. Sheriff Torres assigned Detective Carlos Mendez to investigate Morrison's claim. The timeline was plausible. Grand Island was about 40 miles from Waverly, and someone leaving Murphy's Diner around 9 p.m. could have reached the interstate by 10 p.m. However, Morrison's account raised more questions than it answered. How would Maggie have traveled from the diner to Grand Island without her car? Why would she go to Denver, where she had only distant family? And why hadn't she contacted anyone in the years since? Detective Mendez traveled to Colorado to investigate Morrison's story. He located the truck stop where Morrison claimed to have left his passenger, interviewed employees who'd worked there in 1989, and checked local hotel registrations for anyone named Mary or Margaret during that time period. The investigation consumed months, but ultimately proved inconclusive. Too much time had passed, memories had faded, and records from that era were incomplete or destroyed. As the 20th anniversary of Maggie's disappearance approached in 2009, the case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The original investigators had retired or passed away, witnesses had moved or died, and physical evidence had degraded or been lost. Even Maggie's sister Elizabeth in Denver had stopped calling for updates, accepting that her sister was likely dead and that answers might never come. But in a storage unit in Lincoln, Nebraska, boxes of evidence from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office sat waiting. Budget cuts and facility consolidation had led to the transfer of cold case materials to cheaper off-site storage. Among these forgotten files was everything related to Maggie Chen's disappearance: witness statements, crime scene photographs, her personal belongings, and one carefully preserved evidence bag containing the burgundy apron she'd folded so neatly on her final night at Murphy's Diner. The apron, embroidered with tiny yellow flowers and still faintly carrying the aroma of 34-year-old kitchen grease, would soon become the key to unraveling one of Nebraska's most enduring mysteries. The discovery that would finally shed light on Maggie Chen's disappearance came from an unlikely source: an urban development project in downtown Omaha, 90 miles from where she'd vanished. In March 2023, construction crews preparing to build a luxury apartment complex began excavating the basement of a condemned warehouse that had sat empty since the early 1990s. The building, located in Omaha's Old Market district, had housed various businesses over the decades, including a textile cleaning company that had operated from 1987 to 1991. Maria Santos, the project's archaeological consultant, was conducting a routine survey of the excavation site when workers uncovered what appeared to be a hidden room behind a false wall in the warehouse's sub-basement. Nebraska state law required archaeological assessment of any unexpected discoveries during urban construction, and Maria had been called to determine if the find had historical significance. Inside the concealed room, Maria's team discovered evidence of what appeared to be a makeshift living space from decades past: a cot, some basic furniture, canned goods with expiration dates from the late 1980s and early 1990s, and personal items that suggested someone had lived there in secrecy. But the discovery that would transform a routine archaeological survey into a major criminal investigation was a burgundy apron, embroidered with tiny yellow flowers, carefully wrapped in plastic and hidden inside an old metal toolbox. The apron's condition was remarkable for an item that had spent over 30 years in an abandoned building. The plastic wrapping had protected it from moisture and decay, preserving not only the fabric but also traces of DNA that modern forensic technology could analyze. More importantly, the apron bore a small tag sewn inside the neckband, a laundry mark that read M. Chen in faded blue ink. Maria immediately contacted the Omaha Police Department, who secured the scene and began a careful excavation of the entire hidden room. Detective Jennifer Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the OPD's cold case unit, was assigned to lead the investigation. As she examined the discovery in detail, she realized this might be connected to missing persons cases from the late 1980s or early 1990s. A database search for M. Chen led Detective Walsh to the Nebraska State Patrol's cold case files and the disappearance of Margaret Chen from Waverly in 1989. The physical description of the apron matched witness accounts from the original investigation, and the timing aligned perfectly with the warehouse's operational period. Walsh contacted Sheriff Torres in Douglas County, and within hours, the two agencies were coordinating a joint investigation. The Douglas County case file was retrieved from storage, and Linda Morrison, now in her 60s and working as a senior loan officer at First National Bank of Waverly, was asked to view photographs of the discovered apron. "That's Maggie's apron," Linda confirmed without hesitation, tears forming in her eyes as she studied the images. "Her mother embroidered those flowers, and Maggie told me once that she'd sewn that laundry tag in herself when she started working at different restaurants. She was always so careful about keeping track of her things." DNA analysis of traces found on the apron confirmed the identification. Samples were compared to genetic material collected from Maggie's personal belongings in 1989, and the match was conclusive. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had Maggie's apron ended up in a hidden room in an Omaha warehouse? Had she been held there against her will? And where was she now? The investigation into the warehouse's history revealed a complex ownership structure that had changed multiple times since the 1980s. The building had originally housed a legitimate textile cleaning business called Premium Garment Care, owned by a man named Vincent Carrera. Business records showed that Premium Garment Care had specialized in cleaning uniforms and work clothing for restaurants, medical facilities, and other commercial clients. Detective Walsh's team discovered that Premium Garment Care had indeed provided laundry services to businesses in the Waverly area, including Murphy's Diner. Invoices from 1989 showed regular pickups and deliveries of kitchen uniforms, aprons, and tablecloths. The connection between Maggie's workplace and the warehouse where her apron was found was no longer a mystery, but it opened up an entirely new line of investigation. Vincent Carrera had died in 1998, but his business records, stored in boxes in his widow's garage, provided crucial information about Premium Garment Care's operations. Mrs. Rosa Carrera, now 78 years old, welcomed investigators into her home and shared what she remembered about her late husband's business. Vincent worked long hours, she told Detective Walsh. He'd pick up laundry from restaurants all over eastern Nebraska, bring it back to the warehouse, and work late into the night getting everything cleaned and pressed. He was very particular about quality. That's why he got so much repeat business. Mrs. Carrera confirmed that her husband had indeed serviced Murphy's Diner, making weekly pickups on Thursday evenings or Friday mornings. She also remembered that Vincent had employed several part-time workers over the years, including drivers who helped with deliveries and sorting staff who worked in the warehouse. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Carrera mentioned that Vincent had been troubled by something in the weeks before he sold the business in 1991. He started having nightmares, and he'd get upset when I asked about work. He sold the business suddenly, said he wanted to get into something completely different. We bought a small restaurant in Council Bluffs with the money, and Vincent never talked about the textile cleaning business again. The investigation into Vincent Carrera's textile cleaning operation revealed a disturbing pattern that had remained hidden for over 3 decades. Detective Walsh's team, working with FBI analysts and cold case specialists, began to piece together evidence suggesting that Premium Garment Care had been the center of a sophisticated criminal operation disguised as a legitimate business. The hidden room in the warehouse basement was just the beginning. Further excavation revealed a network of concealed spaces throughout the building, all connected by passages that weren't shown on any architectural plans. These rooms had been equipped with basic living necessities, but no means of easy escape. They appeared designed to hold people against their will. Dr. Patricia Vance, a forensic archaeologist from the University of Nebraska, joined the investigation to provide expert analysis of the discoveries. Her team found evidence that multiple people had been held in the hidden rooms over an extended period. Personal belongings, clothing fragments, and other traces suggested that at least 6 different individuals had been confined in the space between 1989 and 1991. The physical evidence tells a story of systematic imprisonment, Dr. Vance explained to investigators. These weren't temporary hiding places or storage areas. They were designed to hold people for extended periods, while keeping their presence completely secret from anyone working in the legitimate areas of the building. The investigation took on federal jurisdiction when evidence suggested the possibility of human trafficking across state lines. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in historical trafficking cases, was assigned to lead the federal component of the investigation. Her team began analyzing business records, financial transactions, and travel patterns associated with Premium Garment Care and its employees. The picture that emerged was chilling. Vincent Carrera's textile business had served as a front for a trafficking operation that targeted vulnerable women, particularly those who were isolated, recently divorced, or new to an area. The legitimate laundry services provided perfect cover for surveilling potential victims and understanding their routines and circumstances. Maggie Chen fit the profile perfectly. She was a divorced woman living alone, with limited family connections and a predictable work schedule. The weekly laundry pickups from Murphy's Diner had given the traffickers detailed knowledge of her habits and movements. More disturbing still was the evidence suggesting that Maggie hadn't been their first victim from the restaurant industry. Agent Martinez's team cross-referenced missing persons reports from Nebraska and surrounding states with businesses that had used premium garment care services. The results were horrifying. 7 women who had worked at various restaurants and facilities serviced by Carrera's company had disappeared between 1987 and 1991. All were similar in profile: single, divorced or widowed women between the ages of 35 and 55 who worked in food service. The breakthrough in understanding Maggie's specific case came from an unlikely source, a former employee of Premium Garment Care who had been haunted by memories of his time there for over 30 years. Tommy Kowalski, no relation to the former sheriff, had worked as a delivery driver for Vincent Carrera during his senior year of high school and the summer after graduation. Now 52 years old and working as a mechanic in Lincoln, Tommy had seen news reports about the warehouse discovery and contacted authorities with information he'd kept secret for decades. "I was just a kid then, 17 years old, and needing money for college," Tommy told investigators during a lengthy interview. "Mr. Carrera paid well, and the job seemed easy, just driving around picking up laundry from restaurants. But there were things about that place that never made sense." Tommy described how Vincent Carrera had always insisted on making certain pickups alone, particularly from smaller establishments outside of Omaha. Employees were forbidden from entering specific areas of the warehouse, and there were sounds, voices, movement that came from sections of the building that were supposedly unused. "One night in October 1989, I was working late sorting uniforms when I heard a woman crying somewhere in the building," Tommy recalled, his voice shaking with the weight of memories he'd suppressed for over 3 decades. "When I asked Mr. Carrera about it, he got angry and told me I was hearing things. He sent me home early and didn't call me back to work for a week." The timing of Tommy's memory aligned perfectly with Maggie's disappearance. Further details emerged as investigators worked with Tommy to reconstruct his experiences. Vincent Carrera had picked up laundry from Murphy's Diner on Friday, October 13th, 1989, earlier than his usual schedule. He'd returned to the warehouse around 10 p.m., approximately 1 hour after Maggie had vanished, and had worked in the restricted areas of the building until the early morning hours. Tommy also remembered that Carrera had seemed different after that night, more paranoid, more controlling about who could access different parts of the warehouse. The business owner had installed additional security measures and had become increasingly isolated from his employees and even his family. The investigation revealed that Vincent Carrera hadn't acted alone. Financial records showed payments to several individuals who had no apparent connection to the legitimate textile business. Phone records from the era, painstakingly reconstructed from archived telephone company data, showed regular contact between Carrera and associates in other states, suggesting a larger network of criminal activity. Dr. Maggie Chen, a forensic psychologist working with the FBI task force, analyzed the evidence to understand the operation's methodology. "This wasn't random or impulsive criminal behavior," she explained. "The traffickers studied their victims carefully, understanding their routines, their vulnerabilities, and their social connections. They chose women who were less likely to be immediately missed or who could disappear without triggering immediate large-scale searches." The systematic nature of the operation became clear as investigators traced the network beyond Nebraska. Similar textile cleaning businesses in Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas had operated during the same time period, all with connections to missing persons cases involving women in food service. The scope of the trafficking ring was far larger than anyone had initially suspected. As investigators delved deeper into the criminal network behind Premium Garment Care, they uncovered evidence that would finally provide answers about Maggie Chen's fate, answers that her family and friends had been seeking for 34 years. The breakthrough came from analyzing financial records and following a paper trail that led across multiple states and revealed the ultimate destination of the trafficking victims. FBI Special Agent Martinez's team had been working with international law enforcement agencies to trace the network's connections beyond the United States. The investigation revealed that the trafficking operation hadn't been focused solely on domestic exploitation. It had been part of a larger international network that moved victims to various locations worldwide. The key discovery came from archived shipping records found in a storage facility in Kansas City. Among boxes of documents from various defunct businesses, investigators found manifests from a shipping company that had transported textile equipment from Omaha to locations in Southeast Asia between 1989 and 1992. The timing and frequency of these shipments correlated exactly with the disappearances of women connected to Premium Garment Care's client businesses. Detective Walsh, working with Interpol and law enforcement agencies in Thailand and the Philippines, began tracing these shipping records to their final destinations. What they found was a network of establishments that had received regular shipments of what were described as specialty workers during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The investigation led to a startling discovery. Maggie Chen was alive. Now 86 years old, she was living in a small coastal town in the Philippines, where she had spent the last 3 decades working in various restaurants and food service establishments. The revelation came through a combination of facial recognition technology applied to recent photographs and DNA comparison with samples collected from the apron found in the Omaha warehouse. Agent Martinez traveled to the Philippines in June 2023, accompanied by Detective Walsh and a victim specialist trained in working with long-term trafficking survivors. They found Maggie living in a modest apartment above a small restaurant where she worked as a cook, her skills with comfort food having served her well even in a completely different cultural context. The reunion was emotional and complex. Maggie had aged considerably, but was in relatively good health for her age. However, the psychological impact of her experiences was evident. She had limited memory of the early days after her disappearance, likely due to trauma and the passage of time, but she was able to provide some details about her abduction and transport. "I remember being in that kitchen, finishing my shift," Maggie told investigators through a translator, speaking in a mixture of English and Tagalog that she'd learned during her decades in the Philippines. "A man came to pick up laundry. He'd been there before, always polite, always professional. He said there was a problem with some uniforms at the warehouse that needed my attention. I was tired, I wanted to go home, but he insisted it was urgent." Maggie's account revealed that she had been drugged during the transport to the warehouse and had awakened in one of the hidden rooms. She'd been held there for several weeks, along with other women, told that they were being prepared for new opportunities overseas. The traffickers had used a combination of physical restraint, psychological manipulation, and false promises to control their victims. "They told us we were going to work in American restaurants in other countries, that we would make good money and have better lives," Maggie recalled. "Some of the other women seemed to believe it. I knew something was wrong, but I was scared and didn't know how to escape." The transport to the Philippines had been arranged through the shipping company's textile equipment manifests. The victims had been concealed in specially modified shipping containers that provided minimal life support during the ocean voyage. Upon arrival, they had been distributed to various establishments throughout Southeast Asia, where language barriers and lack of documentation made escape nearly impossible. Maggie's story revealed both the horror and the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the trauma of her abduction and forced relocation, she had gradually adapted to her new circumstances. Over the years, she had learned the local language, formed relationships with other expatriates and locals, and had even found some measure of contentment in her work as a cook. "I tried to go home many times in the early years," she explained to investigators. "But I had no papers, no money, and I didn't know who to trust. After a while, I realized that maybe home wasn't a place anymore. Maybe it was just where you decided to make a life." The revelation of Maggie's survival sent shockwaves through Waverly, Nebraska. Linda Morrison, now retired from the bank, broke down in tears when Sheriff Torres called to share the news. After all these years of wondering, of imagining the worst, to know that Maggie is alive, that she survived whatever happened to her, "It's overwhelming," Linda said through her tears. The story of Maggie Chen's rediscovery made international headlines, highlighting both the persistence of law enforcement in solving cold cases and the horrifying reality of human trafficking networks that had operated undetected for decades. But for the small town of Waverly, the news represented something more personal, the return of a beloved community member who had been mourned as dead for over 30 years. Plans were immediately set in motion to bring Maggie back to the United States. The FBI's Victim Services Division worked with the State Department and Philippine authorities to arrange her repatriation, providing medical care, counseling services, and legal support for her return. On September 15, 2023, almost exactly 34 years after her disappearance, Margaret Chen stepped off a plane at Epley Airfield in Omaha, returning to Nebraska soil for the first time since October 1989. Waiting to greet her was Linda Morrison, now silver-haired and using a walking cane, but with the same warm smile that Maggie remembered from their days working together at Murphy's Diner. The embrace between the two women, separated by decades and an ocean of trauma, represented more than a personal reunion. It symbolized the power of hope, the importance of never giving up on missing loved ones, and the possibility that even the most devastating mysteries can eventually find resolution. Maggie's burgundy apron, the key piece of evidence that had unlocked the truth about her disappearance, was returned to her during a small ceremony at the Douglas County Sheriff's Office. As she held the fabric her mother had embroidered with tiny yellow flowers, Maggie wept for the life she'd lost, the years that had passed, and the mother who had died without knowing what had happened to her daughter. But she also wept for joy, joy at being alive, at being found, and at the possibility of spending her remaining years among people who had never forgotten her, who had never stopped wondering where she was, and who welcomed her home with love and forgiveness for the 3 decades she'd been unable to return. The story of Maggie Chen's disappearance and recovery became a testament to the enduring power of community, the dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to let cold cases remain permanently unsolved, and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. In a world where missing persons often become statistics, Maggie's story proved that sometimes, against all odds, the missing can indeed come home.